Hi there. Thank you very much for playing The Beginner's Guide. My name is Davey Reedon. I wrote The Stanley Parable, and while that game tells a pretty absurd story, today I'm going to tell you about a series of events that happened between 2008 and 2011.
So I just played the Beginner's Guide, and all I can say is,
Coda.
wow.
Now,
This is going to be my first ever game analysis, at least analysis in the same sense as my videos on film. The Beginner's Guide may not be my favorite game ever, and it wasn't the most entertaining experience, but it sure did give me a lot to think about. This video is going to assume that you've played the game. If you haven't, it's available on Steam for $10, and it's well worth that price. It's one of the more interesting games I've played this decade, and it's certainly one of the more artistically creative games I've seen in a while. The game's impact will be severely lessened if you see this video first, so please play the game before watching this video. It also breaks the point of the game to have my view of the game be seen as the definitive one, so you should really play the game first. And I also recommend watching Errant Signal's video on the game before watching this, and I especially recommend watching Innuendo Studios' video on the game before watching this, as those two guys have made tremendous videos on the topic that inspired me to play the game for myself and make my own video on the game. The links to those videos will be in the description. The Beginner's Guide is going to be very hard to discuss for a few reasons, which I'd like to deal with before discussing the game itself. The first reason why it'll be difficult to discuss is because the Beginner's Guide stars Davey Reedon, the creator of the Stanley Parable, and the creator of the Beginner's Guide, as himself, and passes itself off as a real, non-fictional piece of work, despite the fact that this is indeed fiction. Because of this, discussing Davey Reedon as a person versus as a character will inevitably mean fumbled language. To get around this, I'll call the fictionalized version of Davey Game Davey, and I'll call the real version of Davey Real Davey. The second reason why is because this game has been interpreted as being anti-interpretation, or more specifically, anti-game criticism. Ironically, in order to feel this way, you have to interpret it that way. But irony aside, I disagree with this interpretation. I do believe that the game is against projecting your interpretations onto the artist by confusing a work of art for the person responsible for that work. I could make a whole video about the problems with anti-interpretation philosophies on art, and how refusing to allow any interpretations destroys art altogether. But for now, I'd like to point out that art is a form of communication. Whether or not you mean to send a message, every single art piece anyone has ever made will send a message in some way. That's just how communication works. If, for example, you say the phrase, "fuck you," to someone, you can't undo that. You can't undo that someone received the message. Now, maybe that person will interpret it as hostile, maybe they'll interpret it as sarcastic, maybe they'll interpret it as a friendly gesture of being mildly annoyed by something they did. There's a million ways that they can interpret the message, but while you do have the right to say what you want, you have no right to the consequences of what you've said. Art interpretation and art work the same way. You can say whatever you want with your work, but people will hear what they're going to hear, and it's out of your hands what the audience gets out of it. So even if the Beginner's Guide was condemning art interpretation altogether, which I don't think it is, I'm still going to make an analysis anyways, because a statement was made with this game, and a statement has no purpose without someone to interpret it. When you choose to put a game out to the world to be played, you have to accept that people will form their own opinions about it, though I do think real Davey Reedon wants people to do that with this game. But just be cautious about assuming anything about his life or personality just by having played it. I'm here to discuss what that statement means, or in another sense, what I heard. This will have very little to do with real Davey, but it'll have a lot to do with the content of the Beginner's Guide. The third reason why this game will be difficult to discuss is because my perspective on the game is informed by my experiences. Usually I try to distance myself from the analysis at hand, and mostly discuss the work of art in a vacuum, but here I basically can't do that, because the Beginner's Guide is so much more about what the audience experiences than other art pieces. Also, because the Beginner's Guide plays a lot into my sensibilities as someone who has experience as an artist of a different sort, and it plays a lot into the struggles I've undergone with regards to myself and relationships in my life, and my own struggles with mental illness. Not to mention, I've made some very basic games myself, and I know enough about game design to be able to spot some of what's going on that would go over the heads of people who have no knowledge whatsoever. Let's keep in mind that, for the record, this is me interpreting a statement. Not what the Beginner's Guide says about real Davey Reedon, but what the Beginner's Guide says about the various topics, symbols, and characters within the game. So let's begin. First of all, the title. Why is it called the Beginner's Guide? The best I could gather is that it's either referring to the beginner's guide to game development, or in a more abstract sense, the beginner's guide to art interpretation. The game certainly helps you understand a little about the development of games and how a developer can gradually improve at making them. That can be demonstrated without listening to Game Davy at all, just by playing the games featured here. But it also serves as a beginner's guide to interpreting art, by provoking you away from the very unhealthy form of art interpretation, which is to project yourself onto the artists themselves, in such a way as to claim that, for example, Kubrick faked the moon landing. The game teaches you, by example, how not to approach art analysis, and in that sense it serves as a sort of beginner's guide into how to evaluate works of art. From there, we discover that the basic premise of the game is that Game Davy is going to show you the collected works of an indie developer named Coda, who developed games between 2008 and 2011, as Game Davy tries to look at the games, pick them apart, and try to figure out what the games in question say about Coda. I don't think I need to say this, but for the record, Coda is not a real person. Coda may be inspired by real people, but that doesn't actually matter. Coda is a character, and in order to discuss Coda, we have to discuss Coda entirely as a character, meaning any inspiration behind the character is irrelevant here. We'll discuss Coda in more detail later. The plot of the game can be summarized like this. Game Davy discusses Coda's games in chronological order, and as the game goes on, he reveals increasingly less subtle red flags that he's an unreliable narrator, which is to say that we shouldn't take his word on everything he says. It becomes clear by the end that Game Davy and Coda had a friendship of some kind that Game Davy had betrayed through his actions towards Coda's games, including changing Coda's games and showing Coda's games to other people against Coda's wishes, for personal validation. This essentially makes Game Davy the quote-unquote antagonist, though there's something very reductive about that line of thought in a game like The Beginner's Guide. In fact, this may be the first major point of debate among players and critics. Is Game Davy a villain? In order to really discuss this idea, we have to discuss toxic relationships, and the way in which the game presents Game Davy. But I'll start off by saying that I don't think Game Davy is a villain or necessarily a bad person. I don't really care for that way of thinking about people in general, and prefer to view people's actions and the consequences of those actions rather than character judgments. And Game Davy has enough complexities to genuinely come across like a real person rather than a character, in which case bad and good aren't as meaningful to a story of this kind. First, I'll talk about the way in which the Beginner's Guide presents Game Davy. The fact of the matter is, the best way to humanize a person, fictional or real, is to listen to them. This is one of the bigger themes of the Beginner's Guide, I think. There's plenty of hints that Coda thinks that Game Davy needs to listen to him. This not only includes the ending where Coda directly speaks to Davy through his final game, but it also includes a few early signs, such as the fact that Coda's games gradually shift to an emphasis on open dialogue between the player and the game, as the games also gradually reveal some form of insecurity in Coda. These later games only start to happen after Game Davy claims that the two characters became friends. So these games could be seen as Coda talking to himself, or Coda talking to Game Davy indirectly through his games, hoping to get through to Game Davy that he needs space from Game Davy for some reason or another. The emphasis in several games is to listen. Most notable of the bunch is the space game where a giant door keeps coming after you. The game asks you to close your eyes, which does indeed make the game impossible to play, but in a more general sense, the game is asking you to shift your focus away from sight to hearing, or in other words, listening. When you stop looking and start listening, things will make sense. That's what seems to be the point of Coda's space game. The door is there as a repeat from earlier, as the door was something that Game Davy was never able to fully get a grip on. The door becomes sort of a symbol in the game, and here I think it's being used to emphasize the fact that Game Davy can't get past the quote-unquote puzzle of Coda. For the record, I do realize the irony of me interpreting Coda's games themselves, but remember that Coda is a fictional character. The reason why you shouldn't project yourself onto a real artist is that there are consequences for that artist. That's one of the major points of the Beginner's Guide. Game Davy's assumptions about Coda himself led to Game Davy directly hurting Coda. Real Davy is a real person. So to go about discussing Game Davy as if he is real Davy would be to make the same mistake that Game Davy does. In the world of the game, Game Davy and Coda are supposed to be real, but in our world, they're fictional. Interpreting Coda's games is necessary to understanding the game on even the most basic level, since the game is mostly about the relationship between these two characters. We need to understand Coda's perspectives through his games, as that's the only option we have. In the real world, this can have consequences, and the game is saying, don't mistake art for real life. Since Coda's art is art within art, it never breaks into real life, and it's pretty much safe to discuss, as long as we don't make the mistake of confusing Coda or Game Davey as being indicative of real Davey. Like I said, we never really get a firm grasp on Coda's perspective, only Game Davey's. This creates a huge conundrum in what the game is actually trying to say. From the perspective of a relationship between two people, we only really truly get one side of the story. I've seen some people say that this game is about an abusive relationship, with Game Davey being the abuser. Others might be more sympathetic to Game Davey, but I guess the question I want to explore is the game more sympathetic to Game Davey? I've discussed this before, how granting a person voice over their story, or the story of a work of art, can do a lot, and how taking it away can do a lot too. In my Barry Lyndon analysis, I discussed how that film seemed to be a deconstruction of existentialism, framing Barry's life and consequences as essentially out of his own hands. The film helped subconsciously driving this point home by changing the narration from the book in such a way that rather than having Barry narrate his own story, an omniscient narrator does instead. This deprived Barry of any control over how his story was told, which forces the audience to become emotionally distant from Barry as a result. By contrast, the beginner's guide gives all control of the story to Game Davey, and takes control of the story away from Coda. On the surface, you could say that this in turn means that the game is being sympathetic to Game Davey and unsympathetic towards Coda, but I think it runs a bit deeper than that. Naturally, there will be some emotional distance towards Game Davey and away from Coda, and that will probably shift 180 for a lot of players towards the end as we learn that Game Davey has been keeping us in the dark. But Coda does have a voice in the game through his games. It's an incomplete voice, and a very quiet one, but enough to make Coda a sympathetic character. We know that his game development was strained by his relationship with Game Davey, and we can at least sometimes trust Game Davey enough to believe that Coda did in fact value Game Davey's friendship at first. But this is all setting things up to be poorly framed, so I'm going to fix that right now. When playing a game like this, many players will probably think to themselves, how should I feel? This is a very flimsy premise for art analysis. It's much more important to ask, how do I feel? Or more specifically, how does this game make me feel? And now I'm going to get personal. I'll keep details to a minimum because my personal life should be none of any of my viewers' concerns, but there are some things that this game did that reminded me of my own life, so I'd like to talk about that now for context. I have borderline personality disorder. What this means is that my emotions are completely out of whack, being hypersensitive. That doesn't mean I'm a crybaby necessarily, or that I'm easily offended, just that when I experience an emotion, it's extremely heightened. So depression is extreme depression, anger is extreme anger, sorrow is extreme sorrow, and happiness is extreme happiness. From there, a whole host of weird symptoms show up. One of the weirder things it does is that it really fucks with relationships. I've had a number of terrible relationships in my life, as well as a number of good ones. The problem is, I've been Game Davey a lot more than I've ever been Coda. What BPD does is it causes an issue of idealization and devaluation. This means that I either think of someone as so great that they're practically incapable of wrongdoing, or I think of them as so horrible that they're incapable of doing good. It's sort of like my mind writes down a pros and cons list of a person's behaviors and personality, and then my mind switches between one side of the list or the other without any in between. I've worked on this considerably over the past few years, but the end result is that I spend way more time in my own head than I do actually listening to other people. That's one of the things I took away from this game personally, that I should listen to other people more often. When I idealize someone too much, it causes codependency where my sense of self-worth is entirely dependent on how that person makes me feel. If they validate me in some way, it makes me feel like I'm not worthless. Or at least that's how things used to be, until I drove a lot of people away with that kind of behavior. What I'm saying is that it's possible to be sympathetic to a person while condemning their bad behavior. I saw a lot of myself in Game Davey in that I understood his need for emotional validation and how that propelled him to do things that ultimately breached his friend's trust and hurt his friend, all while thinking he was doing it for the right reasons. good intentions do not make good behaviors, and giving Game Davy a voice allows us to see that Game Davy had good intentions. However, the betrayal that we as an audience feel when we find out that Game Davy is the quote-unquote villain provokes us to recognize that even though Game Davy always had good intentions, that doesn't make him a good person. Game Davy comes to the realization that we came to about him, and that's an important revelation. There is legitimacy to the claims that Game Davy is an abuser. I don't have an opinion for or against this, because I don't feel like I have quite enough information to say for sure. Specifically because I don't have enough information about Coda's side of the story, and Game Davy is an unreliable narrator. If he is an abuser, the game giving him control over the story may be a way of reaching out to other people in the position that he is in. The position of someone who is capable of wrongdoing, but hasn't yet realized it. In this sense, the beginner's guide would be a statement against abuse by drawing us into the sympathetic perspective of an abuser and then betraying that sympathy. Or alternatively, it could be a statement about how abusers are often given more sympathy and more of a voice than their victims. I've definitely seen this happen a lot, and even if it's entirely coincidental, it calls to mind that issue. In general, I think it can be agreed that the relationship between Game Davy and Coda is toxic. Toxic relationships are not always abusive relationships, but the difference between the two is hard to spot, especially when you're in one or have just recently ended one. Aside from abusive relationships, there's also codependency issues, and if you ask me, I think this is the more likely answer of the nature of Game Davy and Coda's relationship. I joked while taking notes for this that Coda could just be shorthand for codependency, because I think that's a funny coincidence. Regardless, the running thread of a toxic relationship driving one person closer and another person further apart hits so close to home that I felt dead inside at the end of this game, but that's just the BPD acting up. Another angle to the discussion about the toxic relationship is the issue of Coda's gender. Is Coda a guy or a girl? Throughout this video, I've referred to Coda as a guy because Game Davy refers to him as a guy. And although Game Davy is unreliable sometimes, since there's no way of really verifying this exact issue in the game, I'm sticking with male pronouns for now because those are the ones used in the game. There's definitely evidence of Coda being a girl that a lot of people have brought up. When we see the inside of one of the prisons that Coda has developed, we see a woman sobbing. A lot of people think this is supposed to be Coda herself. Coda's supposed role model in one of the games is a woman, and all the voices in the games are female. In fact, this alone is enough to really raise an alarm about Coda maybe actually being a girl, because if Coda makes the games entirely for herself with no intentions of releasing them, then chances are there wouldn't be a voice actress lying around for games that are only meant to be seen by one person. It may matter a lot to some people whether or not Coda is a girl. I actually think it adds a degree of weight to the story too, but I think that it adds a few too many implications that I'm not going to discuss in detail, such as the possibility of Game Davy lusting after Coda and possibly stalking her, the possibility that Game Davy has never actually met Coda and just assumed she was a guy, and a subtle allusion to an abusive romantic relationship. These are all things that are worth discussing, and while it may change some of the emotional impact of the game, it doesn't really change the meaning all that much for what I'm here to discuss, so it doesn't matter too much for this video. What I'm trying to say about the big picture here is that the story of their relationship is the story of Game Davy having to recognize that his behaviors made him no good for Coda, and had to learn the hard way that they need to split. This is something a lot of people can relate to, either from the perspective of Coda or from the perspective of Game Davy. I've spoken in personal conversations a lot about the flaws of thinking in terms of the ends justifying the means. Trying to create the best outcome is self-centered, and can often lead to harming others in the process, including those who you wish the best for. I had to learn this lesson the hard way before I ever played the beginner's guide, so perhaps people can take this game as a chance to reflect on themselves and how they can impact others before they have to learn this lesson the hard way. I think it's something a lot of people need to learn, and just about everyone can use the lesson sometimes, but the important thing is that sometimes we need to stop to listen. We need to read signs before progressing, and we need to be conscious of our effects on others. Now let's actually listen. Let's actually try to figure out what Coda is saying through these games. Yes, I know I'm falling into the same trap that Game Davy fell into, but I'm going to do it anyways because I think it helps to better frame Coda's side of the story, which is impossible to really get an understanding of without looking at the games. I'm going to look at the games twice, once without the narration and once with, so that way I can pick up how Coda's games made me feel, and compare and contrast to how Coda's games made Game Davey feel. Rather than try to diagnose Coda based on his work, I want to look more at why Game Davey's readings of his games failed. The feeling I got while playing the Counter-Strike map was simply, wow, whoever made this sucks at making a map. There's really nothing of significance here other than this was an early attempt at making a level for this developer. The only thing that caught my attention was this green block that made me laugh because around it are a bunch of boxes with the same texture, then suddenly this green block. That's not something you do on accident, that's something deliberate, because I assume it's much easier to just copy and paste. But there's no significance just because it was intentional. Maybe he just thought it was cute. The second game, the one with the labyrinth, it was interesting that Game Davey forces you to skip the labyrinth. When I actually played the game without skipping, I felt a sense of tension because of the sound design. It felt like something might be coming after me, and being in a labyrinth helped that feeling. The more interesting thing though is that when I made it to the final door, the sound design stopped. I was forced into this small room, and this small room is where for a brief moment I felt like nothing was going to get me, and it felt a little safer. This could be where the recurring doorway motif comes from. Perhaps Game Davey ignored this key feature by skipping the labyrinth, and was unable to recognize the door room as a safe space after a tense moment, because he skipped the tense moment and deprived the following room of context. This is also coincidentally shortly after citing the first Coda mark. The third game, which I guess is called The Past Was Behind Her, felt so much like an Ink Repair game in both concept and execution that I couldn't help but think of Ink Repair's games while playing it. The concept is that you walk backwards in order to move, and as you move, the game changes around you and text shows up on the wall, relating the idea of walking backwards to the way in which a character might contemplate her life. This game may be about Coda and may indicate that Coda is a girl, but indeed, the talk about an unknown future definitely resonates with how the story progresses in the beginner's guide. I do think that Game Davey telling you about the game does spoil the joy of discovery a little, and that could be the point here. The fourth game, which I'll call You Are Now Entering, is frankly creepy as hell, and I got very little to say about it. Coda's games have a recurring theme about it being safe to be in the dark, but this one gets under my skin because of the unrealistic portrayal of darkness, and how it makes the player particularly susceptible to something popping up. The fifth game, Nonsense in Nearly Every Direction, was fascinating. Game Davey tells you that there's nothing behind the towers, but when you play, there is a sound in one of the back corners that's really unsettling. And the staircase itself is really unsettling without Game Davey's voiceover to calm you down. When you do slow down, it comes kind of suddenly, and the added effect of creepy noises makes the moment really tense. But when you take away the slow climb, the way Game Davey provokes you to, the end result is that the patience isn't rewarded. Much like the patience of the labyrinth is rewarded with feeling safe at the end of that game, you grow to feel safe in the scary atmosphere of the outside buildings by being forced to confront the scary noises without being able to run away fast enough. This gives a feeling that Coda's games are about adapting to something tense or scary or unknown, and to learn patience. And this is a running thread throughout a lot of the games that is destroyed by the way Game Davey treats them. The game ideas that you discover at the end of this game are fun too, and if you play the game, it's worth reading all of them as fun little jokes and actually some clever game ideas. The sixth game, the door puzzle game, isn't super significant, but the puzzle seems to be bringing about the idea of adapting to something scary or unknown, and extending it to learning to spend time in the darkness. The puzzle is designed so that you have to spend at least a couple seconds in a dark room. It's interesting to note that you never see the additional hallways that Game Davey reveals to you if you play the game without the commentary on. This is interesting because we saw earlier that Coda's game ideas are very strange and really don't cater to the player too much. And the fact that the player can't actually see this is perhaps because that stuff is there for Coda alone, or to make a point. Maybe Game Davey takes away the thrill of our own discovery by forcing us to see it instead of letting us open the code and see for ourselves. Granted, these are all supposed to be source mods, no clip would be very easy, but Game Davey never grants us that opportunity to explore the games through our own lens, but rather force us to see through his. The seventh game is You Are Now Exiting, and I can't think of much significance other than that it's a bit longer than You Are Now Entering. The eighth game is The House That Leads to a Prison. The prison is unfortunately unskippable, which is the point of the game within a game. But for the sake of space and time constraints, I can't really afford to wait. The game once again seems to be about patience, and the platforming section in the middle portion of the game is interesting because the black void that is supposed to signify something bad, aka falling into a pit and dying, turns out to be a safe place to land. making the entire platforming endeavor pointless and again carrying the motif of darkness being a safe place for the player. This is where the first lamppost comes into the picture, and I'll discuss that in more detail later. The 9th game is supposedly the one that introduced Game Davy to Coda. The game is basically supposed to be designed to be a game where players on the internet can leave comments in the room. Since it was supposedly never released, all these comments presumably came from Coda himself. But the problem with that is that some of them could be placed by Game Davy, considering we know that he's editing some of these games. Regardless, this game shows another motif of Coda's, which is things that we're not allowed to access but are part of the game, because there are invisible walls preventing us from accessing other platforms with more text. All of this detail went into stuff that nobody would experience, and that calls to mind the hallways in that one level that could only be accessed by taking the walls away. Another important part about this game is that when you listen to Game Davy, he mentions the first encounter with Coda, with Game Davy being pushy and over-enthusiastic, and Coda being patient. This describes their personalities in the game very well as the toxic relationship between the two. Game Davy always pushing Coda, and Coda always trying not to be bothered by it. The door thing reprises in the 9th game as well. This is where Game Davy shares his interpretation, which is flat out wrong. He claims that the puzzle is about ending one chapter and beginning another chapter of life. I saw it as being about finding a safe space in darkness by being forced to confront it long enough to adapt to it. I could be wrong too, but I'm not projecting myself onto a real person, whereas in the universe of this game, Game Davy is. The 10th game is just a series of small prison-based games that Coda experimented with. Most of them are pretty insignificant, but the well that you get trapped in is relevant to the whole patience in a small dark area motif that occurs throughout Coda's games. Also of note is the part where the game asks you to determine the decorum of the room. No matter what answer you pick, the same furniture appears. The game then pulls back the walls to reveal that there were tons upon tons of those same furniture pieces. If you ask me, even as I played this game with Game Davy's narration, I felt as though he had misunderstood the point of that scene, which was to reveal that your choices were irrelevant. Perhaps the commentary on game choices in general, it certainly draws a parallel to the pointlessness of game choices in other games, with similar multiple choice patterns. I thought it was a clever, non-verbal, surreal way of making a small point, much like an ink repair game might do, but Game Davy's narration again hampers this. Also of note is that the final prison game has a lamppost near where you need to go, which as we know, Game Davy may have placed. Now I'd love to discuss the motif of the lamppost and what it might mean. Of course, Game Davy has his own explanation of what it means, but here's what I think it means. The running motif of Coda's games is rewarding patience and learning to spend time in darkness. Game Davy betrays this motif by placing lampposts in Coda's games. I hope you can see the metaphor starting to manifest, but if not, here goes. The darkness of Coda's games represents depression, sorrow, and general negative emotions. Coda's approach to darkness in his life is to confront it, to learn to spend time in the dark, alone, and be patient and grow comfortable with it. Game Davy's solution is to place a lamppost to make the dark go away. This parallels Game Davy's need for validation from Coda through his games. Game Davy is escaping the dark by planting lampposts in places of darkness, because this is what Game Davy thinks will work for him. The lamppost is Game Davy's need to find significance in Coda's work. That's why he placed it in dark spots. But putting it there destroyed what Coda got out of his games, which was the ability to learn to appreciate the dark. Game Davy stuck his fingers in Coda's dark corners, and that is ultimately the betrayal of Coda's trust. Not that Game Davy changed Coda's games, but that Game Davy took away Coda's safe space away from the world by taking away his literal space of darkness, and taking away his solitude in his games by sharing them with people without Coda's permission. This is why the beginner's guide is represented by a lamppost, because the lamppost is referring to that need to seek validation and enlightenment through other people's works, even if it's at the expense of the creator and the actual work. And yes, again, I recognize the irony of this, but I really think that's what the point of the lamppost is. Real Davy had announced on a blog post that he was struggling with depression and issues of needing validation through review scores and second opinions on his own game. And this may have influenced the beginner's guide and the many things the game makes statements about, but that is wholly irrelevant because even if he wasn't depressed, this game clearly carries these themes in some form or another. So what I'm saying is, Don't take this analysis or the game itself as a diagnosis of actual real-life Davy Reedon. Just appreciate the game for what it is. I also think it's important to note that the multiple choice dialogue system seems a little inconsequential. Certainly it changes what characters say to you, but beyond that, not much about the game changes. What does change though is language, assertiveness, and how the conversation is framed. Most people won't catch on to this, but while phrases may sound like they have similar meaning, there's an element of aggressiveness to some lines over others. Again, I've learned from experience that it's best not to place yourself above others in conversation. Talk about how you feel and all of that, but don't frame your wording in such a way where other people are at fault, or other people are inconveniencing you, or other people are beneath you in some way. I typically find myself answering the less aggressive answers, the ones that are more reassuring, more calm, and less hostile towards other people. This could be entirely incidental, but I want to explore this idea just a little more. Again, like I said towards the beginning, context can change everything. Fuck you can be either hostile or endearing depending entirely on the context. The outcome of the games never changes when you pick any answer, really, but it changes the context a little, in that you can choose either more assertive answers or less assertive. In this sense, it reminds me of several points of discussion I touched on earlier. It reminds me of framing the story from a gender standpoint, and how it's typically seen as more masculine to be more assertive, and more feminine to be more submissive, which again lends credence to the idea that Coda is actually a girl. It also reminds me of the way in which we address games in art and criticism. The assertiveness of you made this game this way, and the game made me feel this way, completely changes the context of the conversation. I read the blog post from Real Davy about depression after the release of the Stanley Parable. It was clear that he was browsing the internet for positive opinions of his game as some sort of validation to get away from depression issues. That doesn't mean he still has depression issues, but I can see how the assertiveness of language can affect someone with depression seeking validation like Real Davy was doing. I can imagine a hypothetical scenario in which Real Davy reads negative review after negative review and tries to shirk it off, but gets a similar aggressiveness in a positive review, where instead of people talking about their experiences with the game, the reviewers try to pry into Davy's motivations behind making the game. And this is what makes the beginner's guide so fucking difficult to discuss. Not that Real Davy might be accusing reviewers of wrongdoing, but that I actually agree with the notion as presented in the beginner's guide. I can't really discuss it without becoming guilty of the same problems. I'm not here to tell you what I think Davy's life is like, or what he goes through, or how he feels. I'm here to tell you what I got out of the game. I'm just saying I can relate to the creator's struggle. I'll stop prying and instead share my own experience on the subject. I'm a singer and a songwriter in a band. If you ask me, we're pretty good. If you ask me, I'm also the worst part of the band, even though I wrote most of the songs. It's what all of my fellow bandmates add to the songs that make them worth listening to, and I always found myself as a weak link, though that could be depression talk. I say all of this because I had to hear quite a number of people tell me that the vocals suck, that I'm the weakest part, or that I need to be kicked out of my own band and replaced with a better singer. To try my best and give my best for a performance that means a lot to me, and then have that performance dumped on by most of the people who even reacted to the album, that really hurts. But you know what? Ultimately, I don't care. No detractors will ever stop me from making music, because the music is mine. The performance is mine. I made it for me. I got something out of the creation of my band's debut album, and I got something out of listening to it in playback, and I still do. As Game Davy inserts lampposts to change Coda's personal significance for Game Davy's own motivations, so do people try to tell me that I'm the weakest part of the band that I've worked hard to do my best with. The aggressive language of framing it as though them not liking the album is my fault, that's the real issue. I can recognize that it's just how they feel and it's just their opinion, but even when I can logically recognize that, depression makes it difficult to process regardless. Whether or not the Real Davy intended or can relate to that idea, that's one of the things I got out of the game. The way in which language can frame things in a toxic manner that some of us could stand to be more conscious of sometimes. I'll admit I'm no exception, because before this game I was, for a long time, ready to make a scathing review of the Stanley Parable. I'll discuss that at the end though. The 11th game is the chore game, where you're in a dark area, and you make it to a warm, nicely lit home where a man asks you to help him with housekeeping. The game just keeps going forever, but apparently it stops abruptly according to Game Davy's changes to the game. The game is fascinating to me because it showcases the whole theme of listening to someone, where you're supposed to listen to this character and do as he says. As you do what he says, you learn from him and discover things about how he feels and how he thinks. Again, it feels like Coda is exploring the idea of listening to someone. I could read further into the possibility that Coda once looked up to Game Davy and found himself listening to Game Davy, but never really being listened to, and that could be the turning point that pushes Coda into the deeper depression of his later games. But really, the details of their relationships behind the scenes isn't as important as what we do see, which is that Coda is taking pleasure in gameplay that isn't traditionally entertaining. To me, it actually was a lot of fun, much the same way that Harvest Moon games might be fun. And part of that is that I was getting to know this interesting character, while part of it was that traditional chores as a game system aren't all that different from more supposedly exciting game mechanics, and I tend to play games more as a system than as an idea. I don't care for violence in games as the point of a game. I play games like Doom for the system. The system of Doom is going around achieving things, but those things happen to be killing demons in Doom, whereas in this house chore game, achieving things happens to be doing repetitive chores. Not a traditional idea, but it's mild entertainment made more fun by the character. Unfortunately, Game Davy's cutting off of the game misses the point, and you never get to fully know the character because Game Davy didn't spend time to actually listen. Again, repeating the idea that Game Davy is ignoring the point in order to suit his own ideas of Coda's games. The cutting off of the gameplay is also symbolic of Game Davy cutting off the thing that Coda enjoys, forcing Coda to move on rather than learning to be patient with Coda. It can be inferred from the next game that this pushes Coda towards feeling inadequate, as he seems to look up to Game Davy and was actually excited to show Game Davy this chore game, that Game Davy then changed to make quote-unquote playable. The 12th game is the college study class. This one reminds me a lot of Ink Repair's A Universal History of Light, which I highly recommend, and may in fact be an inspiration behind this game's appearance in the beginner's guide. But this game is about a professor who seems to have all of the right answers, and at first you just sit there and listen. Again, Coda is emphasizing patience and listening. Then the perspective changes to the professor's perspective, and it's revealed that the professor has 3 dialogue options, and 2 of them are usually blacked out. This means that the quote-unquote right answer is always the one highlighted, which seems to defeat the purpose of having the option of making wrong answers. But it actually is a clever little point about choices in general. The idea that the right answer has to be a conscious choice even if you know it's the right answer. Saying the right thing, doing the right thing, you can choose to do the right thing, but you can still choose the wrong thing even if you're not incentivized to. This game almost feels like an open letter to Game Davy from Coda, saying, "Stop reading too much into my games and changing them, it makes me feel worthless." Again, we see a lamppost as the game world apparently is being destroyed by a vortex. Game Davy fixates too much on the vortex to notice the point of the game overall. The point of the vortex may be that Game Davy is destroying Coda's games, but Game Davy is ignoring that as well. Game Davy also mentions how it's revealed that the professor is as bigoted as we are. Almost a flat admission that Game Davy is aware of faults of his, but completely incapable of recognizing that the game is in part about him. The 13th game is the theater scene where you talk to someone you look up to, but you fumble on everything you say and the game criticizes you like your own insecurities. Then you leave the stage into a very big dark area as gates come crashing down behind you, forcing you further into the dark. This brings to mind the darkness thing from before, and might even extend the metaphor a bit further. What I get from this is that the darkness is, at least with regards to Coda, a metaphor for not just depression, but also obscurity. As Coda fails to talk to his idol, he retreats back into his depression, but it's also the idea that as Coda presents himself to the world through his games, he puts himself too far out for comfort and is forced to retreat back to being a complete unknown. The idea of being in the limelight, aka being on stage, is too traumatic, and he's forced to go back into the dark where he feels safer. Game Davy actually kind of got the idea right here, but he's missing the fact that the game is addressed to him. The 14th game is the one that forces you to close your eyes. Of course, you can't beat the game if you do, but this is again calling to mind the idea of spending time in the darkness. And it's almost as if you're supposed to close your eyes so that you don't have to face the incoming impact of the door, which may have come to represent a blockade for Coda himself. Coda repeatedly inserts unopenable doors into his games, even all the way back from his first game, which is just the Counter-Strike map. Those don't really have to be significant, but the idea of an unopenable door does make a pretty clear comparison to issues that someone can't get past, perhaps information that someone is lacking. I think the bigger message of this game is the message of learning to stop looking for things and start listening. Game Davey spends so much time looking for validation from Coda's games that he's ignoring what Coda's games are actually saying. Coda keeps trying to make it increasingly obvious that something's wrong in a rather passive-aggressive manner. Rather than direct confrontation, Coda seems to be trying to get the message to Game Davey through gameplay and design. Coda reveals that he's running out of the energy to deal with this toxic relationship. Even the very beginning of the game reinforces the idea of listening, probably unintentionally, by reminding the player to make sure audio is on. The ship is also called the SS Whisper, and whispers are a prominent motif of Coda's games. I imagine this has to do also with listening, given that in order to hear a whisper, you have to listen intently. The 15th game is seemingly much more self-involved than previous games, and seems to be mostly a letter of encouragement from Coda to himself. The game walks through the door puzzle with a sense of patience, rather than rushing through. Coda was trying to stress patience, and it seems almost as if Coda is stressing patience with oneself in this game, via conversation with an outside entity of some kind. You don't have the option of speeding through the puzzle. You have to take it slowly. To me, it felt like a creator trying to get back in touch with the original point of their creation that had been lost to the relationship Game Davey had with Coda and Coda's games. The game also allows for more assertive and less assertive language, and if the game is supposed to be completely self-involved, perhaps this is to remind Coda to remain calm and non-aggressive. The game ends with seeing all of the options you selected for dialogue previously, as you tear them away with positive thoughts. The dialogue is important as it stresses the way in which Coda's games have gotten increasingly more complex with time. This mirrors Coda's increasingly more complex relationship with Game Davey, and the reoccurrence of the door puzzle seems to be trying to force the game back into simplicity. Coda is losing control of his games to the complex nature of his relationship with Game Davey, and to the complex nature of more advanced programming. The dialogue in particular mirrors the dialogue between Game Davey and Coda. That is to say, conversations we never see but are alluded to. Breaking all this away, we see a woman crying. The first character without a block for a head. I think a lot of players think that this woman is Coda, and while I've stuck with male pronouns throughout, I do want to elaborate on the whole Coda is a woman thing a bit more. The reason why I stuck with male pronouns is because Game Davey does. It could be argued, and probably has been argued, that this game is about real-life Davey's internal battles. That Coda and Game Davey are both surrogates for real-life Davey. I don't know because I can't speak for real-life Davey. But what I can say is that if that were true, then the mixed-up pronouns would make more sense that way. I've analyzed a few David Lynch films, and his style is very hard to really figure out, but one of his recurring stylistic touches as a filmmaker is that he will bend and contort all sorts of logic in order to fit what he wants to say. Actresses can change characters without warning and seemingly without reason. But there is a reason. I do believe that gender ambiguity is deliberate here. There could be a million reasons. It could be Game Davey asserting power over a female Coda by misgendering her. It could be simply that Coda as a character is a woman, but Coda as a concept is a vessel for real-life Davey and devs like him, making Coda more relatable as a man. It could be that Coda's gender is left up to the player in order to make the game more relatable to the player. It could be that Game Davey never met Coda and wasn't aware that Coda was a girl. It could be that Coda was a guy who made the game version of himself a girl, in part to keep people from reading too far into the games being about Coda himself. It could be that Coda just likes programming girl characters. It could be other reasons I haven't thought of. That said, playing the game without Davey's commentary whatsoever, I felt like Coda was a girl. The games hinted that the creator was a girl in every instance. Regardless, I have to default to the most tangible information that I have, and the most tangible info is Davey's commentary, which is unreliable. The 16th game is almost the opposite of the 15th game, wholly dark and one of the more disturbing moments in the game that I can recall. Seeing the machine is somewhat creepy, but what's more creepy than that to me is the scene right before it. The press hounding you for questions. Apparently you play a woman in this game, which lends more credence to the idea that Coda is woman. Anyways, you meet a machine also named Coda, and you talk really meanly to it, and again the dialogue can frame it as either aggressive or non-aggressive in some way. Then you have to shoot to destroy everything, multiple previous games that reveals a big white space. Your character shows no patience with the machine, but instead nothing but demands. If I could interpret it, it seems as though Coda is comparing himself to a machine, as if to say he has turned into simply a machine to make games for an audience, namely Game Davey. When they get tired of waiting for his next one, they destroy all of his old ones out of impatience. The themes of patience and outside forces destroying one's work repeat here. The 17th game is The Tower, and this is where all pretense of the games being about Coda are dropped. The Tower is just a message directly to Game Davey. Game Davey has to hack the game in order to make it playable. I could not play through it without the narration on. I tried. Basically, this game was designed for only Game Davey to make it through, so that way he would be able to learn that he's disrespecting Coda's designs and Coda's boundaries as a person. It was Game Davey's last chance of redemption to just turn away and let things go, but instead he insisted on making it to the top of the tower, only to find Coda's message addressed directly to him. Again, the game is stressing patience that Game Davey violates. When you actually do make it up, Game Davey gradually reveals that he was mostly looking to Coda's games for personal validation, and that he had changed Coda's games in several ways to make them playable, which points to the fact that Game Davey simply doesn't get Coda's games at all. Coda's games were personal projects to help pass the time or even help with some anxiety issues, and the games got more complicated and started getting shown to more people. Coda lost control over it as his own anxiety became more complicated until it exploded on himself, and he had no choice but to tell Game Davey to never contact him again. It's at this ending that we see Game Davey confront what he had been denying all along, which is that he just isn't any good for Coda. Whether or not you interpret that as abuse is up to you, and it's certainly hinted at very abrasively in the game with the machine. The tower is like that final goodbye letter, where Coda leaves him alone in the dark space, and rather than learning to adapt to it, Game Davey crumbles under the pressure. Speaking from personal experience, I've had to deal with issues of being put into a dark space of my own for so long that I had no choice but to adapt to it eventually. At first I crumbled, but after I started making realizations about myself and learning how to move on. Game Davey does the same thing at the end, and he mentions explicitly the idea that sharing someone else's art with people and talking about the meaning somehow reflected positively on himself, as though he could use other people's art for validation at the expense of the artist. Apart from the obvious parallels with my YouTube channel, there was a very specific relationship in my life where someone's art became necessary for my own validation, and while I eventually learned to accept that what I got out of that art was for me and for me alone, I relate strongly to that need to seek validation by sharing thoughts on other people's works. It very well could be that the beginner's guide is anti-interpretation. It could very well be that everything I said about the game is in BS. It could very well be that Real Life Davey wanted to make a game as a middle finger to critics. I don't agree with this for a few reasons. First is that we can't assume Real Life Davey's motivations one way or another. If we assume it's anti-interpretation, that's still putting that under Real Life Davey. Second is that middle finger type games are not typically this heartfelt and thorough. I don't think he'd be trying to discourage people from taking something away from this game if he made something so strong. Third is that you would have to make something that defies critical analysis in order to dissuade critics. This rather seems to welcome critics. It feels to me like more of a cautionary tale of looking too far beyond the work itself into the person who made the work, and how that can have an effect on the artist. At the end of it all, the beginner's guide is about a lot of things. What I got from it was a meditation on toxic relationships and on the similarity that toxic relationships can bear to game developers and critics/audiences. Not to say that anyone is to blame, but that a codependency can form where developers seek validation from critics and audiences who seek to project themselves onto the games in question. Rather than denouncing any of these things, the game seems more interested in exploring them. The game also has elements of abuse and may be demonstrating the ways in which people can turn into abusers without even recognizing it. The game may also be about real Davy's depression issues and struggling with making a follow-up game after reaching a wide audience with the Stanley Parable. I said I'd talk about the Stanley Parable earlier, and the reason why is because I genuinely could not stand that game when it came out. The game felt like it was trying very hard to be witty and one step ahead of the player, but because of the way the narrator and gameplay choices were presented, I felt disengaged throughout. I didn't care to see what happened because it felt like the game wasn't really about anything other than itself. Trying to be witty is one thing. Trying to be funny or clever is one thing. Trying to be deep is another. All of these things are risky moves that don't always pay off. The beginner's guide goes for something else though. It isn't trying to be deep. It's trying to be heartfelt. That's a much more risky move, but I think it paid off very well. I still don't care for the Stanley Parable that much, but I'm less inclined to project that onto the creator himself, as if to dislike him for me not caring for something he made. The beginner's guide did something not a lot of games do, which is it made me think about a lot of things. Most importantly, it made me think about myself. And it did that with a lot of people, which means it really is one of the more important games released this decade, if you ask me. Without pulling any cheap punches, the game provokes a lot of interesting conversations that game communities and game developers and art critics should start having, and that's a lot deeper than just trying to be deep. Anyways, that's my analysis. I know I left some details out like the maze at the end and the 3 dot markers all over the game, but I didn't want to deconstruct absolutely everything, just everything that resonated with me. Let me know what you think about this game in this video in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.